Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight,
consumers that now can have a choice at the pumps.
Corn farmers celebrate a new ethanol rule. We'll tell you what it means for consumers.
You learn from each time you go around.
Another go-around at running for Chicago mayor for businessman Willie Wilson. Our Spotlight Politics team on that and much more.
Meet Chicago's newest city council member, Nicole Lee, who replaces convicted Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson in the 11th Ward.
Sexually transmitted diseases are on the rise, but Congress is cutting funding. We talk with one doctor on the front lines.
Do you know what city has the fastest growing cargo airport in the world?
It's right here in Illinois.
Rockford, Illinois.
But do environmentalists agree the controversy behind a recent ad from Pritzker's re-election campaign?
I'm Angelita, and coming up tonight, we're offering a recap of this year's Expo Chicago.
But first, some of today's top stories. Disgraced former Chicago Alderman Daniel Solis had a court hearing today. The once powerful chair of the City Council Zoning Committee turned government informant wore a wire during a federal probe of former House Speaker Michael Madigan and Alderman Ed Burke. Today, he pleaded not guilty to one count of bribery. The hearing, conducted by phone, was expected to be a formality since Solis had already admitted he demanded campaign contributions from a company that needed his support to build an apartment on land once occupied by a restaurant in his ward. But the session came to an abrupt halt when an assistant U.S. attorney on the case told the judge that attorneys for the city of Chicago had been in contact with the feds. The city apparently notified the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning that city officials consider Chicago to be a victim of Solis' crime and want to reserve the right to be heard as part of the case. The judge agreed to suspend the hearing until April 21st to give attorneys a chance to weigh in before the case moves forward. A grand opening for a new 102-bedroom group home for seniors in Englewood. Mayor Lori Lightfoot was on hand for the official opening of the 7-story development for residents 62 years and older. The group home includes 14 accessible units and 3 more designed for the sensory impaired. Amenities include community areas, a fitness center, library, computer lab, and beauty salon. The $26 million development is part of the city's Invest Southwest initiative.
Our neighborhoods have been neglected for far too long, and our people need the security of being in a nice place to live.
Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art is set to receive a major donation of around 100 artworks. Leading international art collector and MCA trustee Dimitris Daskalopoulos is gifting more than 350 works to art institutions in Chicago, New York, Athens, and London. The MCA's director described the gift as, quote, one of the most impactful donations to the MCA collection in its entire history. Daskalopoulos says in a statement he was motivated to make the gift to ensure the works were cared for and preserved for future generations and to make them accessible to a broad audience. Up next, the latest effort to lower soaring gas prices. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
There's been much ado about high gasoline prices and what to do about it. The latest effort to inch down costs for consumers relies on ethanol. Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more on what difference it could make both at the pump and for Illinois farmers. Amanda.
Yeah, Paris, there were storms today in New Berlin, that's in west central Illinois, just outside of Springfield. So not ideal conditions for getting seeds in the ground, but it did mean that Marty Marr had some time to talk with me. Marr and his family farm soybeans and corn.
We're getting ready to plant corn right now. Our season has been delayed a little bit because of weather. It's been a little rainy and wet in this area. We did get a chance to get started and plant just a few acres just to get tested and make sure we're ready to go. But this announcement from the Biden administration is really a big deal for us.
He's talking about the ethanol announcement that President Joe Biden made yesterday in neighboring state, politically important state of Iowa. And that is an announcement to allow fuel with a 15% ethanol blend to continue to be sold across America.
E15 is about 10 cents a gallon cheaper than E10. And some gas stations offer an even bigger discount than that. But many of the gas stations that sell it here in Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania are required to stop selling in the summer. But with this waiver, on June 1, you're not going to show up at your local gas station and see a bag over the pump that has the cheapest gas. You're going to be able to keep filling up with E15, and it's going to solve the whole problem.
Ethanol is a corn-based solvent that gets blended with gasoline, but as the president alluded to, oftentimes when you buy gas, it is going to be sold with a 10% ethanol mix. But in recent years, the feds allowed it to move to 15% E15, except during summer months out of concern for smog. Biden's waiver will lift that restriction. Dave Luce with the Illinois Corn Growers Association says it is important that consumers have access to E15.
This is really a consumer issue, I think. Ethanol is 80 cents a gallon cheaper than gasoline. So if consumers are offered E15, that means a lot of times they're saving 5 to 10 cents a gallon for their gasoline over E10. And that's tremendously important right now as we've seen gasoline prices go extremely high. We're seeing our dependence on foreign sources of oil. There's a real concern on energy independence again.
But how big a difference? Marginal, says Brian Battle, director of trading at the investment banking firm Performance Trust.
When you're driving down the road and you see a cornfield, 99% of that corn is field corn. And about 40% of that corn goes to make ethanol nationwide. So what we're talking about is diverting some of that corn that's used for plastics or animal feed and switching that to producing ethanol. So there's a cost to that. There's going to be winners and losers there. I mean, the cost of corn is going to go up. There's going to be more demand for it.
That means that the cost of other things dependent on corn, so livestock, those plastics he referenced, could rise. So why then this focus on ethanol and lowering gas prices?
Because politically, everybody uses gasoline, so everybody will recognize that their price changed. But most importantly, it's something that drives the U.S. economy. So if the price of energy goes up, the price of gasoline goes up, that will affect the price of everything else. Because even if you make widgets, you have to use gasoline to drive it to the store. So there's going to be implicit price baked into all the other goods that we use because gasoline prices are higher.
This is not the end of the road as far as corn growers are concerned. Biofuel advocates like those farmers back a measure introduced by Congresswoman Sherry Bustos of Illinois, the Next Generation Fuels Act, and that would allow for more ethanol blending in the future, higher percentages. Lou says that biofuels are a renewable parallel path that the nation should go down as it moves toward electric vehicles.
Illinois right now has the capacity to produce about 1.8 billion gallons of ethanol per year just within Illinois from corn grown in Illinois. And actually we could substitute 40% of our gasoline with the ethanol produced right here in Illinois.
Environmental advocates are wary, however, of anything that props fossil fuels, and they could take action to stop Biden from implementing this latest E15 waiver. By the way, you will find E15 at gas stations around Chicago. A federal smog reduction strategy actually requires that gas in the region be reformulated so that it burns more cleanly. Not all gas stations across the country are equipped and have literally the equipment to be able to offer E15, but backers of biofuels say that this will put them on the path to be able to put in that equipment. And there is more common, particularly in rural areas across the Midwest and in other areas of the United States. With that, Paris, back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. Mayor Lori Lightfoot and City Council recently confirmed the city's newest alderperson, taking over for former Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson, who was convicted of federal tax fraud. And joining us now is the new 11th Ward Alderwoman Nicole Lee. Alderwoman Lee, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've been on the job here for about 3 weeks, taking over in difficult circumstances. What's been the hardest part of this transition?
Paris, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. I think the hardest part of the transition has just been trying to get my arms around all that the job entails. And I'm learning something new. Actually, I'm learning probably 7 new things a day as I go along here.
That's a big learning curve. And are there a huge backlog of requests from 11th Ward residents?
I don't really have a point of reference for what huge actually is, but there's a backlog of things. There are certain things that only the alderperson can approve. So the staff that were still in the office following my predecessor's conviction did a great job for what they could do to keep things moving. But certainly there were things that have been held up. Permits and things like that we're getting through them right now. Kind of all the dirty work of every alderperson, the permits and the tree trimming and all that. As you know, yes. Yeah, of all that fun stuff. And as you know, Asian Americans are the fastest growing demographic in the city of Chicago. There's been a well-documented rise in anti-Asian hate crime throughout COVID. What can you do on your perch at City Council to address that? You know, I think that the rise in anti-Asian hate has been a really terrible thing across this country, and obviously in particular here it hits home for the Chicago residents, and I live here in Chinatown, and we've also seen a rise on that front as well. I think that being a representative on the Chicago City Council is like the first really big step in really putting a face and humanizing us in a way that maybe residents haven't seen us before, and just seeing us as regular people just like them, and not some other group. Yeah, and you are the lone Asian American alderperson on City Council right now. There was one previously, Alderman Poir, who's no longer there. As you know, lots of city business to get to. Mayor Lightfoot is going to make her pick on a city casino. One of the possible locations is the 78 right near Chinatown. Are you supportive of a casino proposal so close to your ward? So, you know what, Paris, I'm doing a lot of listening right now. My focus in the first couple of weeks has really just been getting my arms around all of what the residents need and what the backlog has been. So I participated in the 78 presentation town hall last week. I'm going to be co-hosting and co-sponsoring a town hall with some other organizations and elected officials, specifically in Chinatown, to hear some feedback and thoughts from residents about the 78 project. So I'll be doing a lot of listening. What have your residents said so far about the project? What I've heard are sort of arguments on both sides. A lot of concern for whether or not a new casino will bring crime, safety and traffic concerns. Obviously, we want to be able to get back and forth reasonably well. And then also the issue of gambling addiction in the Asian American community, and worries and concerns that that our community will be preyed upon. All right, I've also heard from business owners too about looking for the opportunity for more business to come to Chinatown and the South Loop and Bridgeport as well. So I think there are concerns on both sides. The casino's coming to Chicago. I think we've got a lot to weigh, and I'm going to look forward to listening a little bit more and hearing from residents more specifically about their concerns and what we can do to mitigate the bad stuff, if you will, and to make the best of any new development in the city. A lot to keep in mind, although certainly there might be a spillover impact on all those great businesses in Chinatown of folks going to a casino. As you know, the 11th Ward is set to be redrawn. There are 2 competing maps out there, one backed by the Black Caucus, one backed by the Latino Caucus. In both of those maps, it would create an Asian American majority ward in your ward, the 11th Ward. Is there any map that looks better in your eyes? Well, I actually haven't looked at either map very closely yet. Right now I'm representing the residents of today's 11th Ward, and I'm going to review both maps with those residents and their concerns in mind.
And this, if there isn't some kind of deal among Alder people, will go to a public referendum. Folks have said they don't want that to happen. It could lead to kind of a racial fight. Do you worry about this going to a referendum? Would you prefer that it gets solved by City Council?
I think it would always be better for it to be solved by City Council. From what I understand from past history, when these have gone to referendum, it becomes a very expensive bill for the residents of Chicago to pay for ultimately. So, what I'm hoping for is that, some sort of resolution be made. But ultimately, if that comes to a referendum, that the people will decide.
Beyond the issues we've talked about, what are the other top of mind issues that you're hearing from some of your community members?
Safety. I've talked about that previously, as I've been introduced to the public. My top priority and top concern of residents is safety. Just a couple days ago, there was an incident in the ward where, unfortunately, and very tragically, a young lady lost her life. There was a shooting that happened as a result of a car chase that came in from outside the ward and ended across the street from a park where a lot of children were outside playing on the first warm day of the spring season. So it is at the top of my mind. I know it's the top of everybody's mind in the city, especially leaders right now.
Absolutely. And in a year, you and all of your colleagues and the mayor will be up for re-election. You've said that you haven't decided yet whether you want to run for a full term in that office. Have you decided yet? And if not, what's your time frame?
I haven't decided yet. I'm into the third week of the job, and I really want to be sure that this is a job that I can do and do well before I ask the residents of the 11th Ward to consider me somebody that could represent them longer term.
All right, well, we'll watch for that. Alderwoman Nicole Lee, congratulations on the job, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Paris. Have a good evening.
You as well. And now to Brandis with a look at the alarming rise of STDs here and around the U.S. Brandis.
In Paris, across the country, states have been seeing an increase in sexually transmitted diseases even before the pandemic began. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, cases of gonorrhea have increased 45% since 2016. Additionally, cases of syphilis have jumped 50% over the same time period, and congenital syphilis has seen an increase of 235%. Joining us now to go behind those numbers is Dr. Anu Hazra, an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Chicago. He's also part of the Chicago Center for HIV Elimination and a member of Mayor Lightfoot's task force to help prevent the spread of STDs. Dr. Hazra, thank you for joining us. First, what is your reaction to some of these numbers, seeing this increase over the last, 6-7 years?
Yeah, thank you for having me. Well, from the report that was just published this week, it's not very surprising. I think, again, like you mentioned, these increases are not new. It's not just related to the pandemic. These are steady increases we've seen across the board, across all bacterial sexually transmitted infections, now for nearly a decade, now reaching a sort of a 7-year all-time high. I think what it really invigorates a lot of us in the STI world is to really take action and really innovative action to help start to change the curve that we're seeing.
Now, we just cited some national numbers. How would you describe the state of STDs in Chicago and in Illinois?
I think those rises are pretty much parallel in the city of Chicago. I think the certain ones that are the most concerning, like congenital syphilis, while we are seeing rises, they're not as steep as what we're seeing in different parts of the country. And a lot of that has to do with investments that certain large cities do to public health, specifically in the realm of HIV and STI control. So by no means is Chicago perfect. There's still a ways to go, but in some ways in somewhat better shape than other parts of the country.
Now, we've said, it's not just because of the pandemic. You've been noticing this increase for the last 10 years or so. What is causing this increase in STDs?
Yeah, I think it's really multifactorial. I like to separate things by sort of individual level issues as well as structural level issues. I think on the individual level, as a whole, as a nation, we just don't really have great sex education, or more like not much empowerment around sex education. And that goes beyond just birds and the bees, but also just talking about how to take care of your sexual health on a more holistic level. And I think we have a lot of ways to evolve in that type of teaching from adolescence even onto young adulthood. I think at an individual level, folks have a hard time accessing sexual health care or understanding what sexual health care actually means. And then this kind of plays into the more structural level issues that go around in terms of lack of access to care in general, whether they be insurance or otherwise. And then really an overarching theme is just stigmatization that's around just the word sex, the act of sex, and then obviously any infections related to sex itself. I think, as a country, we have a lot to do in terms of dismantling that type of stigma around all STIs, HIV, and everything else.
Now, all of that said, what impact has the pandemic had on what we know about STI infections?
It's very interesting. So I think if you look closely at the CDC report, you see that that the numbers actually look like they decrease in the first 6 months of the year 2020. And that's really probably an artificial decrease, likely more related to the lack of testing than anything else. If COVID has taught us anything, we know that if we don't test for a disease, we don't see it. And so that's what we likely saw at the beginning of the pandemic. But however, what we see is by the end of the year, we matched, if not went above the cases that we've seen in years prior. So I think that's where the pandemic plays the largest role. I think what the pandemic has also done is really been a huge disruptor in the realm of how we deliver sexual health. Closing down a lot of STI clinics during this time, and we know people were still having sex during this time. And so it's not like STIs take a pause because of a pandemic. That still keeps going, and so our work continues.
How has congressional level funding changed over the last few years, and what impact has that had on those organizations that work to prevent the spread of STI?
I think there's been a lot of investments specifically around elimination of HIV as it sort of falls in line with the president's current and the HIV epidemic initiative. And a lot of that funding comes directly from the federal level down to state and city levels and local governments to initiate certain initiatives to help decrease and really get to ending HIV in our country. And a lot of that ties hand in hand with STI control. The two don't live in silos. You have to work in concert with each other. HIV control is dependent on STI control and vice versa. So a lot of this funding that's coming from a national level that's earmarked for HIV, we're able to utilize for sexual health in general because the two are so closely linked as a syndemic.
And Doctor, has there been or have you seen a disproportionate impact on either communities of color, folks who are low income, with regards to those higher rates of sexually transmitted infection?
Like all communicable diseases from COVID onwards, we see these fall along socioeconomic and racial fault lines throughout the country. And so it always has to come down to the haves and have-nots, who has access to care, who has access to education, who has access to resources, and who do not. And that, unfortunately, this country is, again, a structural issue based around sort of structural racism and gender inequality we have in this country. And so it is not surprising to see that African Americans, Latinx individuals, folks who identify as LGBTQ are disproportionately impacted by the rising rates of STIs in this country.
Now, you mentioned some innovative action around this prevention. I know in 2019, Mayor Lori Lightfoot created a task force to address the increase in STDs, which you serve on. Tell us about the work that group does.
Yeah, I think it's really important to realize that any work that we do has to be community informed. Any work we do in this realm can't come from ivory towers. We need to have feedback from what is important to community members and what will actually work on the ground. And so really the task force that we're a part of is a really great amalgamation of academic research experts, clinical experts, but then also community activists and organizers across the south and west sides of Chicago, which are the most disproportionately impacted zip codes, to figure out what are ways we can actually think about STI control amongst these vulnerable communities.
And before we let you go, what more could local healthcare providers, local governments be doing in the face of rising numbers, changes in congressional level funding?
I mean, I think as healthcare providers need to talk about sex in exam rooms. I think, just because your patients aren't talking about sex doesn't mean they're not having sex. I think this whole understanding, again, going back to trying to dismantle the stigma around sex and STIs, just normalizing sort of getting STI testing done, normalizing getting treated for STIs or whatnot, understanding that Sex is part of the human experience, and if we're able to really acknowledge that, then everything else is much easier for us to manage. And then from the government standpoint, really thinking about, again, understanding that while we are prioritizing ending the HIV epidemic in this country, it has to be in concert with its STI control. The two cannot live apart from each other. They all play hand in hand.
Okay, a lot to think about, a lot of work to do. Dr. Anu Hazra, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
And there's more Chicago Tonight just ahead, so stay with us. There's much more ahead on the program, including why some environmentalists are upset about a recent ad from Governor Pritzker's re-election campaign. But first, this year's Expo Chicago may have come to an end, but artists say the support shouldn't end there. They need it all the time. Arts correspondent Angel Edo takes us to Navy Pier for a look back at this weekend's Global Art Fair and shares how Chicago's arts community can help support artists year-round.
I mean, it's very unique to be standing here today because it's not a typical view of this art fair.
The walls that once housed the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art, better known as Expo Chicago, are coming down after its 9th edition. Held at Navy Pier, nearly 30,000 art lovers, collectors, and artists alike traveled from across the globe to take part in the art fair.
Back in 1980, a fair called the Chicago International Art Exposition began our city's journey as a host, and we were built on that tradition. But for almost 20 years, there was only one fair in North and South America, and it was in our city. So, that tradition is what Expo Chicago is built on.
From Cape Town to New York to Detroit, this year's Expo Chicago featured more than 3,000 artists, as well as more than 100 galleries from 25 different countries.
3 of them were run by people of color. So for the first time, Richard Beaver's gallery came in from Brooklyn, New York, and he sold a piece by Melvin Nesbitt Jr. And the piece is called The Great Ice Cream Chase, and it's going to be at the 21C Hotel here in Chicago. So that piece will be here. Also, Miriam Ibrahim, who has been in Chicago for quite a while and also has a gallery in Paris, she signed her first Chicago-based artist.
That artist is Carmen Neely. Patricia Andrews Keenan of Pigment International, a multimedia platform that promotes artists of color, says Neely's style offers a form of sensuality as depicted through abstract paintings. The International Art Fair also included abstract paintings by Rebecca Morris and Gina Litherland.
And that's our next show is by her. She's a painter who is a magic realist who lives in Wisconsin and paints in Wisconsin. And she's a really beautiful painter. Her work often comes out of literature and has all sorts of literary allusions.
And while the city's institutions, both big and small, continue to support and celebrate Chicago-based artists, Corbett says there is more work to be done. He says one of those elements is arts coverage to encourage both artists and art lovers to engage, explore, and continue the work. The other, younger collectors.
If we had those things, then the commercial infrastructure could grow more than it can. It can't really right now because what's going to support it? And so you can't say, well, what we need is more galleries, which we do, without having more on the ground, people around here who were going out and not necessarily buying blue chip established art, but we're taking a chance on younger artists. And that's really essential.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Edo.
And if you missed Expo Chicago but are interested in seeing some of those featured artists, the city's next art fair, called The Other Art Fair, is taking place later this month in Fulton Market. And you can head to our website for more information about Pigment International, Corbett versus Dempsey, and other artists. Now, Paris, we toss it back to you.
All right, Brandis, thanks very much. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, an ad from the governor's re-election campaign is upsetting some environmentalists. We share the details.
What have you guys done in this with this horrible crime wave that's coming to the state of Illinois.
And tensions flared during last-minute legislating before the end of session in Springfield. Our Spotlight Politics team weighs in on that and more. But first, some more of today's top stories. 2 potentially historic nominations to the federal bench in Illinois. President Joe Biden has nominated District Judge John Lee to serve on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals and lawyer Nancy Maldonado to become a district court judge for the Northern District of Illinois. The White House says in a statement that if confirmed by the Senate, Lee would become the first Asian American to serve on the 7th Circuit Appellate Court, while Maldonado would be the first Hispanic woman to become a federal district judge in Illinois. Today is the 30th anniversary of one of the more bizarre and largely unseen disasters to hit the city, and that, of course, is the Great Chicago Flood of 1992. The flood occurred after construction workers sinking bridge pilings in the river at Kinsey Street accidentally breached an old tunnel running under the river. The breach allowed an estimated 250,000 gallons of river water to fill the labyrinth of underground freight tunnels beneath the city and the basements of many downtown buildings. Despite desperate attempts to plug the leak, it forced the closure of offices and much of downtown Chicago for weeks and caused $2 billion in damage. And later in the program, we'll have more on this story and how those underground freight tunnels came to be. And the Bulls' playoff schedule is now out. The Milwaukee Bucks have had the Bulls' number this year, and they'll be Chicago's first-round playoff opponent starting on Sunday. It'll mark the Bulls' return to the playoffs for the first time in 5 years. The defending NBA champion Bucks are heavily favored to win this 7-game series, having beaten the Bulls in all 4 regular season games, including 2 recent blowouts. Sunday's tip-off is set for 5:30 in Milwaukee. Game 2, a week from tonight, will also be in Milwaukee before the Bulls return to the United Center for Game 3, a week from Friday. And now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Thank you, Paris. A new ad from Governor J.B. Pritzker's re-election campaign touts the successes of an airport in northern Illinois. Take a look.
Do you know what city has the fastest growing cargo airport in the world?
It's right here in Illinois.
Rockford, Illinois.
And as Governor J.B. Pritzker helped make it happen. By investing in new
The ad goes on to show Rockford Airport's importance as an economic engine for the state. But some environmentalists say the ad neglects one crucial element: the airport's threat to a patch of ancient prairie. So they took it upon themselves to get the messaging across. Here's a look.
City has the fastest growing cargo airport in the world.
It's right here in Illinois.
Rockford, Illinois.
And as Governor J.B. Pritzker helped make it happen.
And WTTW News reporter Patty Wetley joins us now with more on this story. Patty, the revised ad there, it's of course referring to the Bell Bowl Prairie. Remind us why that's considered a sacred piece of land and what's the threat that it's facing.
Yeah, so Bell Bowl Prairie is a handful of acres tucked inside of the airport's 3,000-acre property, and it's a prairie remnant. So Illinois, the prairie state, used to be covered in prairie habitat. Now there's a fraction of a percent left, and Bell Bowl happens to represent a very small portion of a very important type of prairie known as a gravel prairie. It's 8,000 years old, never been plowed. It's extremely rare. You know, some people have said that prairie potentially is even rarer at this point than, you know, habitats are more endangered than habitats like the Amazon rainforest. So it's very important ecologically to conservationists here in the state.
And now you spoke to some prairie advocates about the governor's campaign ad. What is their response to that?
They were, quite frankly, stunned because to them, the explicit support for the airport's expansion, which will bulldoze right through Bell Bowl Prairie, to them is an implicit support for the bulldozing of that prairie from a governor who has, you know, tried to pitch himself as being environmentally friendly, or who has said, you know, we don't need to have either or. We can have an economic engine and environmental considerations. But this seems heavily weighted toward the airport's argument.
Patty, has the governor responded to their concerns?
He has not. They have not been able to get a meeting or a conversation with him or his staff. They referred to his office as impenetrable. And we did not get a response either from the governor's office, although his campaign folks did tell us that the ad does not signal him taking a side, though the folks in support of saving the prairie would argue otherwise.
Okay. Patty Whetley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Brandis.
And you can read Patty's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. Up next, our Spotlight Politics team breaks down Chicago's mayoral race. But first, a look at the weather. Another candidate throws his hat in the ring to challenge Mayor Lori Lightfoot for her job in an election that is now just 10.5 months away. Plus, some end-of-session action from Springfield with our Spotlight Politics team. Welcome back, Amanda Vinicky, Heather Sharon, and Paris Schutz. So let's start with this. Former Alderman Danny Solis formally pleads not guilty to a federal bribery charge. Heather, tell us a little bit about what happened today and about that agreement that Solis had with federal prosecutors.
Well, this was supposed to be a very pro forma hearing. This was just supposed to start the clock ticking on this 3-year deferred prosecution agreement, which at the end of it promises Danny Solis will not do a single day in jail or lose his city pension, even though he has admitted taking bribes while he served as chairman of the city council's zoning committee. Now, that was what was supposed to happen. It all came to a screeching halt when an assistant U.S. attorney told the judge in the case, hey, the city wants to intervene in this case because they contend that everybody in the city and the city itself was a victim of Danny Solis's crime. So the judge basically delayed everything for a week to give the city a chance to make that argument. In a statement after the hearing, Mayor Lori Lightfoot said that was exactly what she planned to do, and that Solis deserved to be held accountable for his crimes against the people of Chicago, and she was determined to ask the federal court to make that happen. What that means, we're not really sure.
Paris, you know, what could the city be hoping to gain from intervening in this case?
Well, as Heather said, the mayor announced to the public that she filed this victim impact statement. And by the way, there is some pressure among more progressive members of city council to do something here. They don't like the fact that Solis, as part of this agreement, will get off at the end of this. But basically, these victim impact statements usually come into play during trial or during sentencing, claiming that the city was victimized by Solis allegedly taking bribes here. Judging by the prosecutor's statements, it seems like it's probably not going to have much of an impact on the outcome of this case. It seems like prosecutors are very happy with the return they got from Solis, wearing a wire and being a central part of 2 major investigations, that of commented Mike Madigan and Ed Burke. So I think that they believe that Solis not going to jail, getting the charges dropped is probably worthwhile for the service that he's rendered as an agent of the government here. Of course, the city will make its case, though, and we'll see what that case is.
Paris, is that not a little strange? I mean, we haven't seen the city intervene this way in any other corruption cases for city representatives.
It's certainly not something that I've seen before, but like I mentioned, there is some political pressure. The current alderman that took over for Solis, Byron Sig Joe Lopez, has been pretty vocal about his desire that Solis face more punishment than he is right now for the alleged crimes here. So perhaps the mayor is making a political nod here to the more progressive members of city council, saying, hey, you know, my whole brand here is transparency, cleaning up corruption, ending aldermanic prerogative, which, by the way, was a big part of what got Solis in trouble as chair of the zoning committee. So there might be a little politics at play here.
Amanda, bring us up to, or take us back just a little bit. Solis's bribery charge, it dates back to money that he received from a developer in 2015. What happened?
Well, so real briefly here, stepping back, I have to say this move by the Lightfoot administration is certainly an interesting one, because you've got to figure that federal prosecutors are like, hey, wait, What are you talking about? Because Brenda, you just asked it right there. This is for conduct dating back to 2015. He wore a wire for extended period of times with Burke and with Madigan, that they're saying, stop messing up our case, Lightfoot. You should know. You're a former prosecutor yourself. You know how this sort of things works. Just have your press conferences. Don't interfere with our courts. What happened here, and really the conduct that is in the deferred prosecution, is a singular count where allegedly Solis used his powers as chairman of the powerful zoning committee to get campaign contributions as the zoning committee gave its approval, seeking those contributions right then and there, despite warnings from his staff that that might be a bit brazen. You want to maybe disguise this a little bit, don't you think? By the way, this is for a development company connected to the owner, the Reinsdorf of the White Sox and the Bulls. But there's a whole lot more. The Chicago Sun-Times uncovered a federal affidavit where allegedly Solis did a whole lot more than that, was also soliciting, for example, Viagra, massages, stays at a luxury farm by a campaign contributor. So there's a whole lot more. The DPA just focuses on this one.
Okay, so businessman Willie Wilson announced that he is once again running for mayor. Wilson expects to have town hall meetings over the next few months. Here he is this week discussing Chicago's crime rate and police morale.
Crime is high. Crime used to be prior to 3 years ago in certain neighborhoods. Now they went out the whole Chicago and suburban as well around the country. So it's all our problem. We got to get in and fix it. Police morale is very low. And those men and women put their life on line out there for us.
So Heather, how does Willie Wilson's entry into this race shape the election?
Well, I think it does two things. One, it reemphasizes the fact that pretty much everybody thinks Mayor Lori Lightfoot is vulnerable if she does run for re-election, as we all expect her to. The second thing is that it sets up a really interesting contest in the Black community in Chicago. Willie Wilson won 13 of 18 wards where majority of voters are Black, and he was a real kingmaker in the 2019 election, where his endorsement of Lori Lightfoot, openly lesbian, married to a woman, had a daughter. Willie Wilson is well known in the Christian Black community, and his endorsement of her served to sort of as a way into that community for her. Now that he's going around telling people that he made a mistake, that he regrets that endorsement, that could have a real impact, and it could make it honestly impossible for Lightfoot to get to 50% of the vote in the first round of voting, which is set for February 23rd of next year. So it could have wide-ranging impacts, but like you said earlier, we are 10 months away. A lot of other people are going to get in this race, and it is just going to be, again, a free-for-all.
Now, we said it's, 10 and a half months away, but that's actually, that's not that far away for some of us. So I want to keep it moving and get to Springfield, because in the final days of the spring session, lawmakers pushed through several bills, including one waiving violations and tickets related to carjackings. While calling for stricter penalties, House Republican leader Jim Durkin referenced a family member who was the victim of a carjacking.
My niece was carjacked at 2 o'clock in the afternoon outside her apartment in Lincoln Square. So when I see her over the holidays, she has been traumatized like any other person has been traumatized through such a horrible experience, through no contribution on her own. So she's going to ask, what have you guys done in this with this horrible, horrible crime wave that's coming to the state of Illinois?
So Amanda, remind us about some of the bills that passed in Springfield before the end of session.
Brandis, there were something like 408 bills that passed, and Illinois, presuming the governor signs these, is set to get, a new rock, a new a state reptile. But when it comes to the big ones, they really were focused on the economy / passing a budget, tax relief, and also crime. The issue being that while you're going to have Democrats selling this and saying, hey, we heard your concerns. We passed measures that are going to address crime, funding a whole lot of programs that get to the root of crime, violence prevention efforts, community organizations, the task force that was referenced, allowing police to cooperate. There were also some major bills that did not pass. Those, for example, that the Cook County Sheriff has said are central to being able to crack down on carjackings, and that's being able to trace carjacked cars through help of auto manufacturers. Republicans calling for stiffer penalties and greater debate. This all really goes back to a 2021 major crime overhaul that I think we're going to be hearing a lot about in the days ahead, as before that mayor's race, we've got, of course, the gubernatorial one.
Now, Governor Pritzker, he still needs to sign these bills into law. Of course, Paris, are all of these gonna pass his desk with his signature, or is he gonna let a few of them go?
Well, picking up from where Amanda left off, the thing about ending session with all these bills is now we're gonna see weeks of press conferences by the governor and signing ceremonies for these bills. And I think
rallies, really, Paris, right?
Pep rallies, really. And he's got an election, as you mentioned, in November. And, you know, I think with the crime bills, I think he will sign the ones that did pass. I mean, clearly he will, because Democrats politically are a little scared of the crime issue in the political races. Republicans are making that the #1 issue, the crime wave, and touting their belief that Democrats are soft on crime. So Pritzker's going to need some events that make the news, that show Democrats taking action on issues like crime, carjacking, and retail theft. So he will sign those. He will have press conferences that, as Amanda said, will look like pep rallies, and he will hope they make the news reports so voters take a look at them.
Now, a report from the Independent Monitor overseeing the consent decree binding the Chicago Police Department to reform indicates the department is still falling behind in some capacities. Heather, bring us up to speed on what this report says about the status or the progress that CPD is making.
Well, this agreement has been in place for more than 3 years, and while the police department has made some progress towards fulfilling its requirements, it's still behind on a number of issues. And I think most importantly, the independent monitoring team found several areas that the police department has essentially needs to work on immediately, including the foot chase policy and its plan to encourage what the department calls positive interactions with community members. The report was very critical of the department on both of those issues. And I think it's crucial that we're now far enough into this agreement that not only is the department not in full compliance with it, but new problems are popping up. And I think that that will pose a real problem for the department as it attempts to restore or create trust in Chicago's community, where, of course, the department has been accused of repeated misconduct in pretty much every aspect of policing.
Amanda, really quickly, how does this status report compare to where the police department has been in previous status reports?
In terms of a progress report, there was actual progress. I think a 20% jump from the last one and about 70% compliance with the consent decree, which is well above, as I indicated there, what prior reports had shown.
And Heather, there's a bit of news today with regard to the vaccination mandate for Chicago police officers. What's happening there?
Well, today was the day for officers to get their second and final shot if they got the 2-dose Pfizer or Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. And now the ball is really in Mayor Lori Lightfoot's court, how she will discipline those officers who have refused to get vaccinated. And it's clear that part of the solution there has been granting a huge number of exemptions based on religious or medical issues to members of the department. More than 1,000 members of the Chicago Police Department have gotten those exemptions, which still leaves about 700 officers or a little bit more at risk of being disciplined or terminated because of their refusal to get the vaccine.
So Chicago City Clerk Ana Valencia, who's running for Illinois Secretary of State, now she is facing allegations of steering contractual work towards her husband, Rayad Kamzi. Paris, what is the criticism that Valencia is facing here?
Well, her husband is a lobbyist who has lobbied the city, he's lobbied the state, and the big policy achievement for Valencia as city clerk was this city card, ID card that went out to everybody. It turns out, according to this latest reporting, that her lobbyist husband is a partner in the company that got that contract, so got money from that. And then it also turns out that Valencia reportedly lobbied Mayor Lightfoot for a kiosk program to be put in the Illinois Medical District. It turns out, according to this reporting, that her lobbyist husband would have benefited financially from that as well. So this is a very tricky issue for Valencia, because one of the jobs as Secretary of State is to oversee the lobbyist transparency rules for the state. So voters are going to be looking at her record, and she has vowed that her husband will not lobby the state or any state agencies as if she wins that office. She's running, of course, against Alexi Janulius and David Moore in the Democratic primary. But we'll see if that's going to be enough to assuage the concerns here with this lobbying/public official arrangement.
So a new joint analysis by the Daily Line, WBEZ, and Crane Chicago Business looks into city council meeting attendance rates by alder people dating back to 2019. Heather, we've got about 45 seconds. What did this analysis find in the way of the average aldermanic attendance? What did it tell us?
That the most veteran alder people are the least likely to actually show up to do the public's business at public meetings. And a lot of them have a lot of excuses about why they haven't made those meetings. What's interesting, though, thanks to the pandemic, the committee meetings are all still virtual, and that boosted attendance from about 60% back in 2019 to about 80% now. We all know it's easier to roll out of bed and throw on a top than to actually make it down to City Hall. So it'll be interesting to see whether those committees stay virtual, since more older people happen to be attending them.
Okay, that's Spotlight Politics. Thanks to Heather Sharon, Amanda Vinicki, and Para Schutz. Up next, remembering the Great Chicago Flood 30 years later. Stay with us.
Certainly we can celebrate, but we also have to recognize what so many people have gone through because of racism and what people continue to go through.
I think that Americans are finally beginning to embrace that we are African, we are indigenous, we are European, we are Asian, we are everything.
As mentioned earlier, today marks the 30th anniversary of one of the most bizarre stories in Chicago history. The Great Loop Flood began on April 13, 1992. Some downtown buildings mysteriously began flooding. Fish were even found swimming around in those basements. The flooding led to a halt in subway service, a shutdown of the Board of Trade, and mass evacuations. The city searched for answers in a long-forgotten tunnel system. Here's a clip from the recent WTTW production, Chicago Stories, Downtown Disasters.
Over at City Hall, they scrambled to make sense of it all.
There were a lot more people than usual in the City Hall press room. Everyone was just buzzing with what is going on. I remember I kept asking my news director, "You mean the river is flooding its banks? How is that possible?" And he said, "No, it's flooding underground." And again, I was like, how is that possible?
Chicago's resident transit historian had a hunch. Listening to the news from his desk at the Merchandise Mart, Bruce Moffitt pieced together the clues.
I thought instantly, it's got to be the freight tunnels. All these buildings had one thing in common. They were connected to the freight tunnels.
I think the freight tunnel system in Chicago is sort of a surprise to most people. The freight tunnel system was originally designed as a way to bring telephone wires to downtown buildings. So this is early 20th century. And so a small company decides to build this tunnel system.
And they started as Illinois Telephone and Telegraph. And they did build a telephone system.
But the company had another plan. It secretly built tunnels big enough to operate a small railroad.
One of the things you have to remember about Chicago at the turn of the 20th century was that it was one of the fastest growing cities on earth. And as a result of that, it was congested.
The reason for freight underground was simply to avoid downtown loop congestion.
While Illinois Telephone and Telegraph did have a license to install wires down there, it did not have permission to build a railroad.
The alderman, the mayor were shocked that this was going on. I think the aldermen were more shocked that they were missing out on a revenue-generating opportunity for themselves.
There were allegations the company gave 21 aldermen $110,000 in the back of a bar. And in 1906, Chicago's freight tunnel system opened for business. Sitting 40 feet below the loop, it was the first of its kind in the world.
It was considered an engineering marvel. It ultimately would make it to about 62 miles of tunnel. It was under every street downtown and a bit beyond. The freight tunnels were used specifically for bringing in coal, for heating and hot water, removal of ash, and for package express.
But by the late 1920s, the tunnels started losing their competitive advantage.
Part of the reason was the advent of the motor truck and their ability to handle larger loads and go greater distances.
By 1959, the freight tunnels were closed and largely forgotten.
They did some minimal inspections, but it was really out of sight, out of mind. It has no impact on day-to-day life until things get disrupted.
The tunnels had most certainly been disrupted.
You'll have to watch to see what happens next. The Great Loop Flood of 1992 ended up being a $2 billion disaster, and it started 30 years ago today. To watch more of Chicago Stories, Downtown Disasters, head to WTTW.com/Chicago Stories. And catch the latest episode of Chicago Stories, Madmen of Chicago, detailing the city's rich history as a leader in the advertising industry. That premieres Friday night at 8 on WTTW and online. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Hear from community residents and business owners on Chicago's 3 casino proposals as part of our In Your Neighborhood series.
And one-on-one with top civil rights attorney Ben Crump. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm dedicated to preserving the dignity and rights of all individuals.